Well, September 11, 2001, I was sitting in my 6th grade social studies class when our principal came running in yelling for us to turn our TVs on because we all had TVs in our classroom. And just then we saw the second plane circle around and crash into the second World Trade Center tower. It was really terrifying, especially being a 6th grader and not knowing what was going to happen to America that day.
September 11th, 2001, I was a kindergarten teacher at Olympia Elementary School in the Judson School District. I had a student teacher that year, and she was in full teach. So when I heard that something was happening, I ran to the front office and sat with all the office staff as we watched on a little tiny camping TV the events unfold. It was horrific. We were all in the office just dumbfounded and crying, and at the end of the day, I grabbed my infant son and hugged him a little tighter, and hugged my husband, who was still training at Randolph Air Force Base as a flyer, hugged him a little tighter because this would affect his life and our life. It was a horrific day, one I will never forget.
September 11th, 2001, I was in the 8th grade. I had injured myself that morning, so I was actually in the nurse's office at my middle school when I heard that the 2 twin towers had been hit. Mom pulled me out of school to go get my hand x-rayed, so I was in the doctor's office. They had it on TVs the whole day. I came back to school, and all we did all day was go from one class period to the next, and we just watched it on the TV. One student finally asked the teacher, are we going to do our real work? And I remember the teacher saying, this is a very important day in history. You need to watch this because one day you're going to be telling a younger generation about it, and you're always going to remember where you were when it happened, and they were right.
September 11th, I was in 7th grade, and we had been on an all-girls overnight field trip with the middle school. And I remember them loading us all back into the buses and heading us back to school and telling us what had happened. I didn't really understand what was going on, but I did know that I lived about an hour away from school at the time. So I kind of was a little worried about how I was going to get home and were my parents safe and where everybody was. At the time, I was going to school about 5 minutes from the Atlanta airport, which is the busiest airport in the world. And a lot of people were worried that it wasn't a safe place to be. So we were all worried about that, and we all wanted to just get home safely. And eventually my mom came to pick me up, and we went home and watched the news, and it was a crazy day that I'll never forget.
On September 11th, 2001, I was a student here at Texas A&M University. I was 19 years old. I was a sophomore in college. That morning I woke up to a friend across the hallway telling me to turn on my TV. When me and my roommate turned on the TV, the first thing we saw were both of the twin towers on fire and burning. And that's basically how we spent our morning. We did stop and we went to class that day briefly. The professor there basically just talked for the hour that we had class about what was happening. We watched there. It was an economics class. I still remember the class. I still remember what we talked about. After the class, we came home and we continued to watch. Every channel had the same thing on it. I remember flipping the stations, Nickelodeon, MTV. Every channel was the news. You couldn't turn anywhere else. We watched when the towers fell. We watched when we watched every second of it. And if there was something we missed, they would show it again and again. It's just one of those things that's burned into your brain.
Hi 5th grade, Mrs. Hilbert here. Just wanted to share with you where I was at on September 11th, 2001. Just as you are today, I was also a student sitting in my freshman English class. I was about 14 years old, and I'll never forget, one of the teachers from across the hallway came running into my classroom, whispered something to my teacher, who had then immediately turned on the TV. We basically spent the rest of the day watching the events unfold live on TV, and as you can imagine, there were many questions and concerns. However, my teachers did a great job making sure that we all knew that we were safe, and they answered any questions that they could. And I look back on that day and it just makes me proud to be an American, to see the way our country handled adversity.
I was 20 years old and a sophomore in college at UTSA on September 11th, 2001. I remember I was getting ready for school and I had the news on, but I didn't really realize what was going on just yet. My brother called me and he told me, Becca, you need to turn on the news right now. And that's when I really kind of focused in on what was happening and was just completely stunned at the events that were taking place. What's always going to really resonate with me and with my family is the fact that it was my little sister's 18th birthday on September 11th. And so we wanted to go out and enjoy her birthday for dinner that night, but we were very conflicted. We tried to be, happy for her, but we were also just incredibly sad and in shock about what had happened that day.
On September 11th, I was living in Houston, Texas. I worked in a building. I got there early in the morning, but I didn't know what was going on yet. We did not have social media at the time, so the news did not travel that fast. But I got to the employee lounge, and there was a lot of people there, and they were surrounding this 19-inch TV because that's all they had in there. And I said good morning to everyone, but nobody responded to me. And when I got closer to the TV monitor, I saw what was happening. I was in shock. I thought that it was a movie, and I was very sad. And I wanted to go home, but I had to stay there all day.
September 11th, 2001, I was 18 years old, my first year in college here in San Antonio at UTSA. Our professor came into our class and told us that one of the towers had been hit by an airplane, so we all went to the main hallway and we were watching the news live. And as we were watching the news, we saw the second airplane hit the second tower, and it was just an overwhelming feeling of disbelief and sadness, but at the same time it was a great feeling of support that we all gave to one another and as a country. And we need to continue to remember those brave victims and heroes of that day. And 9/11/2001 will forever be in our hearts.
September 11th, 2001, I was a 7th grader at Stevenson Middle School. During the last class of the day, my principal came on the intercom and told us about the terrorist attacks that had happened and the planes that had hit in the various locations. When he told us about a plane hitting the World Trade Center towers, I was really scared because my dad travels every week for work, and I knew that when he was in New York, I knew that his classroom had a wall full of windows that faced the World Trade Centers. So I raced home as soon as school was over. My mom was there, and she told me that my dad had left New York 3 days before September 11th, so he was in a different city. My family was very fortunate that day, and I know that there were thousands of families that weren't so lucky.
So I remember exactly where I was on September 11th, 2001 when I found out about the first plane hitting the first tower. I was in my car on my way to drop off my almost 1-year-old daughter at daycare when I heard the news on the radio, and I immediately called my husband at the time to let him know if he was aware of that. And again, I was in the car on my way to drop off my daughter at daycare before heading off to work.
September 11th, 2001, I was an 8th grader here in San Antonio. I was in PE class when the attacks began, so I didn't hear about it until after PE when someone told me there was a terrorist attack in New York. At that time, I didn't really understand what was happening. I remember classes were a lot quieter, teachers were a lot quieter, we had busy work instead of normal lessons. And then it didn't really hit me what had actually happened until we were at home and my parents sat us down and told us what was going on, and we watched the news the entire night to see what had happened.
On September 11th, 2001, I was in the 7th grade sitting in Mr. Reedy's social studies class. My principal came on the intercom and explained to us that that night's football game would be canceled due to the terrorist attacks that had happened earlier that morning in New York City. I didn't know at that point what a terrorist attack was. I had no idea what he was even talking about. It wasn't until I got home and I saw the news and watched the footage for the first time that I truly understood. That was a day that I will never forget.
Hello, Miss Benavides here. Let's see, for September 11th, I was at San Antonio College in a biology class when the teacher was pulled out of the classroom and later came back to inform us that there had been an attack at the Pentagon. I didn't hear about the Twin Towers until later. And I was actually sitting next to a man who had a family member who worked at the Pentagon, and he was trying to try to keep in touch with family to see if their family member was okay. So school was dismissed and I went home.
Hi, fifth graders. I'm Mrs. Trevino. And on September 11th, 2001, I wasn't working that day. I had a little boy who was in the hospital. He was really tiny. This is a picture of him. It was taken within a few days of 9/11, actually. And I was on my way to the hospital. I was typically used to getting ready while watching TV. And that day in particular, I was just riveted by the television. We were scared. We were in a state of confusion. We didn't know what was happening. It would take really a couple of days to fully understand the full magnitude of everything that had happened and how our country would change forever.
On September 11th, I was in 7th grade. It was the second week of school, and my class was coming back from specials. When we got back to our classroom, our teacher had the TV on and she was crying. And we were all really scared and confused. We sat down and it was completely quiet in the room. We were watching the news on the television and were really scared and confused. We didn't really understand what was going on, but my teacher was very upset, so we knew that it was something really scary.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, I remember exactly what I was doing. I was in my 3rd grade classroom at Passmore Elementary. I didn't have a TV in my classroom at the time, but the teacher across the hall did. I walked across. I had seen that the first plane crashed into the tower. By the time the second plane crashed into the tower, we knew it wasn't an accident. My first instinct was to check on my now 16-year-old daughter, who was not quite 1 at the time. When I got home, we finished watching the rest of it on the news.
On September 11th, I was student teaching at San Antonio ISD, Agnes Cotton Elementary. I was student teaching 3rd grade, and I remember it was our conference time and going into the teacher's lounge, and the TVs were on, and of course the news was on. All the images of the Twin Towers being hit. It was just shocking to watch, and none of us understood really what was going on. One of the teachers next to me was trying to get a hold of her son who lived there in New York, and it took her a long time before she was able to reach him, but he was fine. Some parents started coming to the school and taking their kids home because, like us, they didn't know what was going on and they wanted to be with all of their family. And I remember going home that evening and calling my parents and talking to them about what had happened and what we were all seeing, and just trying to really understand how something like that could happen. It was a very, very sad day.
On September 11th, 2001, I was in 7th grade attending school at Jordan Middle School here in San Antonio. I didn't hear about any of the attacks that happened until I was in my 2nd period class, which was English. My teacher turned on the TV and we just began watching CNN, seeing everything that was happening. At the time, only one plane had crashed into one of the towers, and we just watched the entire class period. And finally, my principal came on the intercom and said that we had to turn off all TV and continue class and continue with our day. So I didn't know about anything else until I got home from school.
On September 11, 2001, I was in the 3rd grade. I remember our principal came in and told our teachers to turn on the TVs.
we saw the second tower get hit. And as third graders, we had a lot of questions. We had no idea what was going on. My teacher, Mrs. Morris, did a really good job of explaining what had happened and drew a map, showed us the location of where the Twin Towers were. Later, when the Pentagon was hit, she again showed us that the Pentagon was in a different location and explained to us what these buildings did. We were very confused, and she helped to make us not feel as scared in that moment.
Your classroom teachers asked me to share where I was with you on September 11th, 2001, and to be honest, it's a day I'll probably never forget. I was a senior at Communication Arts High School working on an assignment in the computer lab, and the news station CNN was playing on the TV in the background. They were covering what was going on in New York. As I looked up, I witnessed the second plane crashing into the World Trade Center. It was a truly horrible thing to watch, and I hope I never have to witness that again in my lifetime.